We're going to look at two different passages today, Genesis chapter number 24 and also Genesis chapter 35. So you'll want to hold your finger in both of those places there. Genesis chapter 24, and I don't know how many of you have been in D groups in the Old Testament. Some of our D groups are in the Old Testament now, and they've been going through reading some of these stories, and this is something that intrigues me. That, you know, God doesn't put things arbitrarily in His Word. He puts everything there on purpose. And so when you're thinking, we're going to look at a character, if you would, or a person within the Bible that we don't know a whole lot about. It's pretty obscure. We're going to look at this person, and we're going to glean a few things about this person. And I love what God does, because, you know, He always takes the unordinary. He always takes the little thing, always the out of the way, always the thing that the world thinks is useless or unworthy or anything else, and that's what He chooses to use to do mighty things for Him. All right, and so there's a lady here, and we're going to look at her. And but this particular story, let me set the backdrop for you a little bit. This is Abraham has sent his servant Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac. All right? This is one of those stories we don't preach about a whole lot, but it is one of those good stories. All right? So and this begins. It covers several passages, several chapters. But again, we're going to just target on a few things here. But as you think about that story, so how would you like to find your wife that way? Your daddy's sending somebody else to go find a wife for you. Or better yet, how would you like for somebody else to come and say, hey, I know a guy who's looking for a wife. Let me come go with me. Yeah. I don't know how well that would go over today, but this is how it went down back in that day. And so you remember the story. The servant goes to the well just outside there, and he sits by the well. And he asked the Lord to give him a sign saying that, you know, I'm going to ask the woman to give me water. And she's going to agree to give me water, but she's not just going to say, hey, I'm going to give you water. She said, let me water your camels also. All right, and that was the whole premise behind that. So what does he do? He goes to the well, he sits down. Here comes a girl. Guess what the girl's name is? Rebecca. That's right. All right. So Rebecca comes along, and he says to her, look, could you draw me out some water to drink? And then what does she say? She says, well, look, I'll draw you out some, and then I'll draw some out for your camels also. And so what, in his mind, the light bulb went off, didn't it? Okay, this is a sign that the Lord is giving. This is the one. And so now they go back, and he begins into talking to the father. And I'm trying to remember here, Bethuel, I think is his name, and then Laban is also Rebecca. I think they're brother and sister there, and so the servant Eliezer goes into their house. He's conversing with them about who Abraham and Isaac. He has a son, and he needs a wife, and they're trying to bring them back together. And so this is where we're going to pick the story up. All right. So Genesis chapter 24, look in verse number 57. So they're talking about whether she's going to come back with the servant or not. All right, then it says, and they said, we will call the damsel, this is Rebekah, and inquire at her mouth. What is she going to do? You're going to give her a choice. And they called Rebekah and said unto her, wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go. And they sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse. I want you to underline that little phrase there, and her nurse. And Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said unto her, thou art our sister, be thou the mother of thousands of millions, and let thy seed possess the gate in those which hate thee. And Rebekah arose, and her damsels. There's another word. So it says her nurse, then it says her damsels. And they rode upon the camels and followed the man, and the servant took Rebekah and went his way. And Isaac came from the way of the well, Lahorai, for he dwelt in the south country. And Isaac went out to mediate in the fields at the eventide, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, behold, the camels were coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she lighted off the camel. And she had said unto the servant, What man is this that walketh in the field to meet us? And the servant had said, It is my master. Therefore she took a veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all things that he had done. And Isaac brought her into her mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. And he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. All right, so an interesting story there. But there's one little lady here. And so let's just go through a few of these things. There's some, and I want to fast forward a little bit, all right? And we'll get there after we read Genesis 35. But I really want to bring Joseph into this picture, all right? Now, everybody remembers the story of Joseph, correct? All right, Joseph, you remember, as a little boy, he began to have dreams. Remember that? The Lord was giving him dreams about how the stars were going to bow down to him, representing his brothers, and even the sun, moon, and stars, bearing the sun and the moon, and representing his parents were even going to bow down to him. And remember the whole story. His brothers hated him, and he was sold into slavery, ended up in Potiphar's house, and all of that. You remember the story, right? Well, there were some influences, if you will, in the life of Joseph. All right, well, this maid happened. Now, I want you to go with me here. All right, this maid that we're talking about, this nurse, this person that came with Rebekah to Isaac, she had an influence on him. This is what I believe. She had an influence. Now, all of us, I want you to think about this, the people that have come along in your life that are seemingly insignificant. I mean, to the world, as the world would say, they're insignificant. But look, there are people in your life that have come along that have had an influence in your life, that have made a difference or an impact in your life that nobody else will ever know. Those little out-of-the-way people. You know what I'm talking about? You can think of one right now, can't you? An aunt or uncle, whatever, a friend, a family member, a co-worker, whatever it was, but they have made an impact on you. I've got people all throughout my life that I probably never mentioned their name to you, but they have deposited something into me, you know? And we all have people like that. Well, this lady, and we're going to get to that, but I think she deposited even a little something into the life of Joseph. Now, just bear with me. All right, this is a long time before Joseph. This story we read is a long time before Joseph ever came on the scene. All right, so now let's back up. So but I believe there are 5 women who actually had this influence on the life of Joseph. And I'll give you those 5 real quick. I believe that Leah, it was not his mother, but this was the other wife that Jacob had. Remember her? I think that she had some influence in him. And remember, she was unloved and rejected. Remember that? So I think there were some lessons that he learned, or some deposits, if you would, that were put into his life by the way that Leah lived her life. So you had Leah. She was like a stepmother, if you would. All right? But they were still 2 women in the house. That was a weird situation. But nevertheless, I think she had an influence. I think Rachel had an influence in his life. Rebecca. No, yeah, Rachel. I'm sorry, I'm getting all my names mixed up this morning. Rachel was actually his mother. All right, so you had Jacob, who had wives of Leah and Rachel. Remember those 2. So Rachel had an influence on Joseph's life. Now, Rachel, it talks about her being beautiful on the outside, and it talks about Leah being tender-eyed, meaning that she was not so good looking. All right, that's really what that means. All right, but now Rachel, it talks about her being good looking, but then I would also say to you that Rachel, I think, was good looking on the outside, but not so good looking on the inside. There was all sorts of animosity towards Leah within that household. There was all sorts of things, and as a matter of fact, she had to be reprimanded because when she got married, she brought her father's gods with her. And so she had some of that going on in her life. So he could look at that and see and glean some things, learn some lessons from Rachel as well. Now, there was another woman who had some influence in Joseph's life, and that was Potiphar's wife. Do you think she had some influence on him? Now, while he was sitting in prison after being wrongfully accused, I'm sure he had time to contemplate that influence. But nevertheless, this was an evil influence in his life, and he had to analyze that and learn from that. Another one was actually his wife. He took an Egyptian wife, and her name was Asenath, And she was actually the daughter of a heathen priest. And so there's a picture in and of itself with that whole story. But dealing with idol gods and the Egyptian culture and all that. So there were some things that were put into him from that as well. But then there's a lady here that we're talking about. Now, I want us to go over to chapter number 35 now. We're going to read something. Now, we're fast forwarding a little bit. And it says, "And God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there." Now, we're fast forwarding a generation or two here, all right? "And there make an altar unto God. There appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. Then Jacob said unto his household, and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. And let us arise and go into Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under his oak which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. So Jacob said to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, that is Bethel, he and all the people that were with him, and he built there an altar and called the place Elzabeth, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. But Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died." All right, now remember, who was all the way back in Genesis 24? Who are we talking about? You remember that thing I had you underline? What was her title there? It was nurse, all right? All right, but Deborah, so now we're given a name. We're given a name, all right? So this lady is named Deborah. All right, and we'll look at that a little deeper in just a moment. But Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak. And the name of it was called Alanbacath. That's interesting. And that's really all we have. And God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padanaram and blessed him. All right, let's just stop there. But my main point here is I want to talk about this lady, Deborah, for just a few minutes this morning. All right, Deborah. Now, all right, so let's look first of all at her introduction. And the first thing here is the employment that she had. Now, let me just say that it is said back in chapter 24 that she is a nurse. All right, in other places there, and then it also calls her in chapter 35, verse number 8, and it calls her a nurse again. Now, this is also, I think it said damsel. But this has the idea of she was a servant in the house. This gives that idea. There's a couple ways that you could become a servant in that day. Now, a lot of people today, in the day that we live, they try to point at instances like this and say that, slavery was condoned in the Bible and that kind of thing. This was not slavery like owning people. That was not what this was about. There were rules and laws in the Old Testament and in Leviticus, you can go and read these, that people sometimes would become poor. Matter of fact, I think I wrote this verse down. Go to Leviticus chapter 25. Verse number 39. "And if thy brother that dwelleth with thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as an hired servant, and as a sojourner he shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children with him, and shall return and his own family, and unto the possession of his father shall he return." So look, there are times in the Bible where people would become indebted, or they would come to where they would owe money or needed money, and what they would do is they would sell themselves, if you would, all right? That's what the Bible calls that, sell themselves for a certain length of time, for a certain amount of money, and become a servant. And then at the year of Jubilee was the 7th year, and so usually about 7 years long, and then they would be freed from that burden of working or serving. And so they would be freed and go back to their own home, back to their own families. But they would willfully do this sometimes. So how did somebody enter into servitude? How did somebody enter into being a servant or a maid or a nurse, that type of thing? It could be voluntary. Okay? They were poor, needed money, and they would come in almost like an employee-employer relationship. That's kind of how this acted. Now, there were times where people were taken into captivity and into slavery because of warfare and that type thing. You see that with Babylon. Babylon brought back a lot of Israeli children. You know, Daniel was one of them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were others. And so you had all of these that were in servitude and in slavery because of warfare. All right, and then there were times that sometimes people would sell themselves into slavery to pay bills or get money or whatever. And then they enjoyed working there so much, or enjoyed living there so much, or enjoyed so much a part of their family, or they didn't have anywhere else to go or anywhere else to turn to, and they would become a bondservant. In other words, they were willfully choosing to stay and voluntarily work as a servant within that household. Now, this particular lady, it never calls her a bondservant, but we see her all the way back and she was actually in Bethuel in her family, being a nurse or a maid or a helper to Rebekah. All right, we see that's the first time she's mentioned there. But we understand this is how we're introduced to her. She was introduced because of her employment. All right, and then it also says, now if you are a servant in the house and you've been working there for a long time, there is an expectation that you have of a servant like that. All right, and the expectation you have is to be trustworthy. Could we agree on that? I mean, when Joseph was sold into slavery, remember that? And then later on, he was sold into the Ishmaelites, and then later on, he was sold to Potiphar. Now, remember Potiphar. He had been with Potiphar for a little while now, and Potiphar, what did Potiphar do with Joseph? He put him in charge of everything that he had. Remember, there was absolutely nothing that was kept back from him. If anything went on in Potiphar's house, he knew about it, he controlled it, he took care of it. The only thing that he kept back was what? Was his wife. That's right. That's the only thing that he didn't have control over. And so what I'm saying to you is, when servants are brought into the house like that, they're expected to be trustworthy. Now, I will say, in the day that that Joseph lived, what would have happened if he was not trustworthy? All right, there was an accusation that was made. What did they do with him? They put him in prison, didn't they? And so there's an expectation here that she was trustworthy. So this is the introduction that we're given to her. We see something about her employment. Now, this word nurse, it could be, and I know we've got little ones in here, all right, so I'm going to be discreet. Now, there was something in that day, and even in modern times, something called a wet nurse. Does everybody understand what that is? It means that sometimes they would take children and nurse them that were not necessarily their own children. All right, so this could have been that case, but most people think that this is more like a maid or a servant in the house. That's really more of what this is, I believe. It could have been. It could have been a wet nurse. All right, but nevertheless, this tells you a little bit about her. So they have brought her into the family at some point for whatever reason. Most likely she was indebted or needed some money, or she was poor, needed a place to make a living and to have food and that kind of thing, to get provision. So she starts in Bethuel's house as Rebekah's servant, or Rebekah's maid, or Rebekah's nurse. All right, and then what is the next one? Who does Rebekah marry? Rebekah marries who? Isaac. All right, and then Isaac. And so she's still in that household. We see her going with her. She's still in that household. Now, who does Isaac? Who's Isaac? Whose children are Isaac's? We have Esau and Jacob, right? All right, and then you keep going, and then there's Jacob. Let's go a little further. And then Jacob has how many sons? 12 sons. The 11th son is named what? Joseph. All right. I know I'm giving you a lot of information this morning. All right. So we've got to halfway get an idea of what's going on here. So how many generations is that? All right. So look, and it is believed that Deborah died when Joseph was about 7 years old. As a matter of fact, Rachel died when she was giving birth to Benjamin, which was the youngest. All right, and it is that time that he's about 7 years old. Joseph is about 7 years old. So she has been a servant in this household for how many generations? At least four. At least 4 generations, and she's been there. And she's been. So would you say she's trustworthy? Absolutely. And she has become part of their family. And so this is her employment. This is her introduction. Now look. And I want to give you some impressions that she gives, all right? So let's look at one thing here. Let's look at her title, chapter 35, verse number 8. But it says Deborah. That's her name. We understand her name. But Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak, and the name of it was called Alan-Bacath. And so that name Deborah, guess what that name means? It means a bee, B-E-E. Now, if you've ever watched bees, some of you have honeybees in here. How many of you have honeybees in here? All right. There's a few. Something about honeybees is, you know what? They are constantly working, aren't they? I mean, when you think about a bee, what's something you think about, Adam? You got bees, right? Or did have. What's something you think about when you think bees? Hardworking? Do they ever stop? Hardly. I mean, they might slow down a little bit in the wintertime or something like that, you know. But I mean, they're always, and all those little bees working all together, and guess what? That's why you have honey, right? And so all that pollen and all, in the springtime, you know, when all of us are crying and snotting and everything else, because we got all, man, they're going around gathering all that stuff and they're bringing it back and all those little things, and they're what are they making out of it? They're making honey out of that. And man, I mean, they stay busy all the time. But this is what her name means. It means bee. So what could that, and you know what? Names in the Bible are significant. If you go and read, as a matter of fact, Jacob, what was his name? It means supplanter. Is that the type of character that he possessed? It means deceiver. Absolutely. He deceived his brother about the birthright. I mean, he lived up to his name. But then later on, he wrestled with God. And remember, God changed his name to Israel, and it means he had prevailed. He prevailed with God. You know, and so names are important. So this lady by the name of Deborah, her name means bee. What does that tell us about her? I mean, it means that she was always busy. She was always working. She worked tirelessly. How often did your bees complain? They just did their job, didn't they? I mean, they didn't complain. They just do their job, and they're going back and forth and doing what they're supposed to do. They're trustworthy. I mean, do you have to wonder? I mean, I understand there's certain circumstances, situations, if another outside source comes in and corrupts the hive or knocks the hive over and eats the honey. Sometimes we have bears do that or something like that. But honestly, if you don't have any outside sources, do you have to wonder when you get close to July and August if there's going to be honey? It's kind of an expectation, isn't it? All right, and so I mean, the expectation I think that we have of her, the impression that we ought to have of her, is that she was busy. She was a worker. She did that. And by the way, a bee is I think, one of the most industrious insects known to man. And so, I don't even know if they're an insect. Is that the wrong word? Are they an insect? What are they? They are an insect? Okay. All right. So anyway, so this is her title. And so now let's look at her time. This is her title. Now let's look at her time. Her time now, she has impacted several generations. She started out with Bethuel, the son of Nahor, Abraham's brother. That's where Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, went to go find this wife. All right? This is the father of Laban and Rebekah. And then, of course, from them come Isaac. Rebekah marries Isaac. And then from them you have Jacob. And then from Jacob you have Joseph. And about the time she died, she's about 7 years old. Joseph is about 7 years old. Now, it's interesting, and I go see them on occasion, but Eldridge and Peggy Clark, they're getting on up in years, and Miss Peggy, she used to sit right back there about where Miss Ann's sitting, and she used to sit back there, and you know, she had dark hair, and she worked at Troy Lumber. She worked at Troy Lumber, and she told me that she had worked there when she was, I guess maybe started there when she was a late teenager, or a teenager, about 18 years old or something like that, and had worked there up till retirement. And she had been there for at least 3 generations. All right, with those the ones that own. I can't think of his name right now. Fred Taylor, that's his name. The Taylors. He had been through 3 generations of Taylors. She had, and some of them had already passed on. Some of them were retired. Some of them, but she had been there that whole time. That just longevity, and so that was her time. And here, this lady Deborah, she had served over these years, and been faithful all over these years. She had served for these 4 generations, and just a faithful, hardworking lady. Could we say that? I think we could. But then also, just for alliteration purposes, this is her termination. Now, I don't mean she got fired. I mean she died, all right? So let's go back again to verse number 8. It says, "But Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak, and the name of it was called Allen-Bacuth." Now, if you go and look at let me see here, the name Allen-Bacuth, it means, this is what that word means. It means the oak of weeping. The oak of weeping. So hold on here. We've got a lady. We barely know her name. She's mentioned one time in the Bible. She's hinted at in Genesis 24. We're mentioned to her name by name in Genesis 35. And here she is. She has served behind the scenes now. Behind the scenes all these years. Now look, we know the stories of Isaac and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Don't we know those stories? We know them. We know the story of Joseph. We know those stories. But here's somebody that's behind the scenes that has been in every one of those families. Think of that. We hardly ever see anything about her except in these 2 instances here. And now we're getting to the end of her life. And you look back across that, and what are these family members doing at her death? Oh man, they're weeping. This is not just a hired hand that just showed up one day. This is part of that family. You understand? This is an influence that she's had on them. And I'm going to tell you, they're heartbroken and they're weeping because of what she meant to them, what she had done. Now look, we don't know everything that she's done, but all I know is that, look, it says they put her under the oak and they named that place the Oak of Weeping. And they were all gathered around that oak at her funeral, weeping because of the impact that she made. And there are times, let me just say, so let's look at this for a moment. All right, now let's bring Joseph into this. Joseph's about 7 years old at this time. Remember, she's been in these families all these years, right? And now Joseph is 7 years old. And this is probably, I would probably surmise to guess, I'm guessing a little bit here, this is probably one of the first occasions that he's ever had to go to a funeral or been acquainted with death in any way. This is probably one of the first times. And here they are, they're weeping. This is somebody that was very dear to their family. And now they've gone to be with the Lord. And so you have him here, and he's dealing with this, the first close contact with death. And now I want you to think about, let's look at the parallels here at something that Joseph learned from this lady. All right? Now look, with this lady, I don't know how she came, we don't know how she came into being a servant. Most likely it was not just, hey, she didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'm going to be a servant today. She was most likely put into that position because of some hardship or some situation that she encountered and probably didn't want to be there. She was forced into this situation most likely. And that family brought her in, gave her work, gave her a job, and actually became part of that family. But here's the thing. She was forced into this, bit pressured, if you would, into that position of servitude. And look, and she worked with patience, and she worked with persistence in her service. What was her name? What does her name mean again? It means bee. So she was very... Are bees patient with their work? Are they persistent with their work? Absolutely. But then, you know what? Somehow along the way, she was promoted, wasn't she? As not just a servant, not just a maid. What was she? She became part of that family, didn't she? She became part of their heart, part of their love, and they're weeping at her funeral because of the impact that she had made in that life. And she was promoted because of that. Now let's think about Joseph for a moment. Now, Joseph, we looked at several women that had influence in his life, but let's think about this woman. Now, look, we don't know a whole lot about her. She's behind the scenes, not a whole lot going on with her. And she comes along, and let's do some parallels. Was Joseph placed in a position where he didn't want to be? But was he patient and persistent what he went through? I mean, the Bible tells us the Lord was with him. Everything that he touched prospered and all that. And then eventually he was promoted, wasn't he? He was promoted, and God used him. And look, I'm just saying to you today that I think as Joseph was looking at that woman, and I think that was a life that he could model after. And I think as he was sitting there in prison at times, maybe sitting there in a pit, he could remember the influences that this lady had on him. I should have used this for Mother's Day or something. But nevertheless, all right, 3 lessons we can learn real quick, all right, and I'm going to break them down for you. One is prominence. Look, we know about Isaac, we know about Jacob, we know about Rebekah, we know about Rachel, we know about that. But I'm going to tell you, we don't know a whole lot about this lady, but one thing we do know, that I believe she had an influence on Joseph. I believe she had an influence on all of them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been weeping at her funeral. They wouldn't have named the place where they buried her. And so, what I'm saying to you sometimes, look, I'm up on a platform. Some people may know my name. Honestly, I could care less about all that. But look, there are people that are serving in our church and serving around in churches that, look, we may never know their name, and I'm going to tell you, they're probably going to have a greater reward than the one standing on the platform because, look, they did their jobs and they had an influence and they didn't have a big name. Everybody didn't know who they were, but there was somebody that was working behind the scenes to carry on the work and to stay busy doing the work, never getting recognition, never doing any of those things. And I'm going to tell you, those are the type of people that God uses, and God uses the faithfulness of people just like that to bring influence. You may think, look, is what I'm doing. There are times as a pastor, I said, man, am I doing anything? Am I getting anything accomplished here? You as a Sunday school teacher, you might get that. Hey, am I ever getting anything accomplished? I'm just telling you that, look, you remain faithful. You do what God's called you to do. You serve where you've been planted. And I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter about the prominence. It doesn't matter if you see the fruit or not. Where do we see the fruit in this lady's life? At the end. At the end. And you know what? There's a whole lot of people when we get to heaven, and we're going to get to meet them. And I'm going to tell you, we may not know their name, we not know what they did, but I'm going to tell you, there's going to be people in heaven that God's going to say, hey, this is the one I want you to know about. It's not the one that was on the platform. It's not the one that had the big name. It's not the one. It's the one that was behind the scenes that was being faithful and serving, and nobody knew their name. So this is a lesson on prominence. This is also a lesson on perception. Now we can see her effect. As we really dig into this, you can see her effect that she had on these families. She became part of that family. We see that effect. And so look, don't look at the things of what is. You just be faithful. You continue serving the Lord. And look, the fruit is left up to Him. The honor, He will exalt you in due time, the Bible tells us. He will lift you up. He will glorify. We just humble ourselves. We keep serving. We keep being faithful. And look, it doesn't matter what the perception is. The only perception that matters is what God sees. There's also a lesson on persistence. I've got to hurry here. All right? We're not told about her talents. We're not told about her ability. We're not told about her intellect. But I think what we can surmise for this is we can surmise her faithfulness. She was faithful where she was. Look, there are things that you may aspire to be. I want to be a doctor. I want to be, and look, those are very prestigious things to be, and that's great. But I'm telling you, we can't neglect where we are for what we want to be. You understand what I'm saying? Man, there were times, and I was a young preacher, and man, these big guys, they would be coming in, and they would be preaching these messages, these great, man, and I would love listening to that, man. And I said, man, I want to do that one day. And then you actually get to be that person from time to time. You say, man, I wish it was somebody else. God, could you just let somebody else do this, you know? And but nevertheless, look, where God puts you, it doesn't matter what capacity it is. Don't get your eyes so far out in front that you fail to see what's right in front of you, and be faithful right where you're at, and continue serving right where you are. We're not told a whole lot about this lady. We just know this family loved her, and we're told that she was a maid, she was a nurse, she was a helper in the house. We don't know what all that is, but all I know is she served those 4 generations. I'm going to tell you, she served faithfully in that house. And I'm going to tell you, the influence that she had did something that the other influences that in some of these kids and some of these families that couldn't accomplish. And so I'm just saying, there's something said about being faithful. There's something said about being faithful. The Bible tells us it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. God has given us certain things. He's given us certain abilities, certain talents, certain resources. And I'm just telling you that God puts a premium on faithfulness. And I'm encouraging you this morning. Look, we have a decent-sized church, okay? And look, not everybody gets recognized for everything that they do. All right? But I just want you to know that God sees it. God sees it. And God will reward it. God takes note of it. And I just want to encourage us today to say, look, here we are. And God just wants to encourage me. Look, I don't have a limelight. I'm just behind the scenes. And look, you just don't know how blessed a pastor I am, because we have so many people like that want to work behind the scenes and do certain things. And, you know, I don't really have to ask that much to hey, can you come sweep this floor? Or can you come do this? Look, I do it. If I have the opportunity, I do it. But I'm just saying that, look, just that years of faithfulness does something that nothing else can do. People watch that, people see that, and I'm going to tell you, whether you know it or not, you're having an influence on people just by being faithful. Amen? All right. Miss Cynthia, I'm not going to do an altar time this morning, all right? Perhaps you don't know the Lord as your Savior. I don't know. I'll be here after service. Look, we've got a meal today. You can come talk to me. I would love to share the gospel with you. I would love to share how you can know for sure that heaven's your home. No questions in your mind about it. Nothing whatsoever. You can be 100% certain that heaven's your home. Perhaps, you're struggling in the position that you have. You're serving. You know what? I'm tired. I'm weary. I'm doing all... Look, I'm telling you, faithfulness does more than you'll ever know. Continue being faithful. Continue being faithful. Continue serving. God sees it. God sees it. And it's not overlooked. Perhaps you have some other burden on your heart and on your mind. I don't know. Others we need to pray for. Things going on. We need to lift one another up in prayer. And now we're going to enter into the time of our Lord's Supper. And I just want to express to you what this means, all right? And what this means, this is in remembrance. This is what the Bible tells us to do. This do, even on the front of the table there, it says, this do in remembrance of me. In other words, what we're doing today is we're remembering what Jesus did for us at Calvary. He gave His body. His body was broken. His body was marred. The Bible tells us He was marred more than any man. And that bread that we're eating, it is unleavened bread. The unleavened means it is without sin. Leaven in the Bible is a representation of sin. And so it is without sin. Jesus, His body, He was a sinless, perfect sacrifice. That's why we can sit here today and offer. That's why we can say, hey, Jesus saves, because there was something different about Him. He was the perfect sacrifice. He paid our debt that no one else could pay. This is His body that was broken for us. And so this is a reminder for us to look back at Calvary and what He did for us, how He paid our sin debt. Now, the grape juice here that we have today, that is a representation of His blood to remind us of the blood that was shed for us. What does the blood do for us? The Bible says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. It is by the blood of Jesus Christ that our sins are cleansed, our sins are gone. There's a song that is sung. There is a fountain filled with blood. You remember the song? Drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunge beneath that flood, lose all their guilty stains. Now, this particular ordinance that we're doing, this particular has nothing to do with your salvation, all right? This is for those that are saved, this is a church ordinance for those that are a member of a church to look back and remember what Jesus has done for them. This is not salvation, but this is a remembrance of the time that Jesus did save you, and the time what He saved you from, and where He brought you from, and what He did for us at Calvary. That's what the Lord's Supper is. So as we're taking this, administering the Lord's Supper today, I want us to, in our mind, think about that. This is a time to reflect where I am personally with the Lord. There are some areas of weakness that I need to confess, I need to deal with. Because this is a time for us to remember what He did so that we can purify ourselves and live for Him like we never have before. This is why we do this. This do in remembrance of Him. All right, so I'm going to ask